Just as physiological conditions limit human perception, so too do psychological ones. Here, feelings, which shape experience and behavior, are formed by focal points, generated by goals. As with life, its central point is the command, anchored in the psyche, to follow one's feelings, especially the life drive. This drive developed approximately 3.5 billion years ago and continues to operate today. There are quite a few people who consider themselves intelligent, but have no idea how strongly they're controlled, especially by the midpoint mechanics. A powerful supporter of this blindness is the illusion of free will. That is, the belief that one makes decisions solely with one's ego. This blocks the recognition of the fact that humans are shaped by goals that originate less from the cognitive realm and more from the emotional one. When pursuing a goal, anything that is not conducive to it can be mechanically less perceived or not perceived at all. This can also include criticism. This can lead to blindness for a shorter or longer period of time. Of course, cognitive influences play an important role in modern times, but from the depths of the psyche, feelings generate strong, extensive, and individual guidance. Since the beginning of all life, it has been, as already noted, controlled by feelings. That is why they play such a strong role, even today. Furthermore, in every human being, there seems to be a deeply ingrained, emotional belief in something supernatural, which developed over the course of evolutionary history from the drive to understand. My aim is to clarify that there is nothing supernatural that doesn't operate according to goals and laws. All fantasies beyond this originate in our brains, which produce them out of ignorance. Endless illusions and convictions can form, especially in humans, and shape their perceptions and behavior. Everything in the universe, without exception, is guided by goals that must be oriented according to the laws inherent in substances. Naturally, all living beings are subject to this process. The psyche consists of neural networks that have been structured by the goals within the respective living being. The midpoint mechanic is the executing tool of the psyche. This is guided less by reason and more by emotional goals. This also means, if the goals change, then the psyche also changes. Blindness arises from not knowing how the psyche works, that is, the lack of knowledge about the mechanics that operate in living beings, particularly those involving emotions, because they are indispensable for learning and achieving goals. This automatically excludes, temporarily or permanently, everything that is not relevant to the respective goal. The limitation of perception is thus caused by legal processes designed to achieve goals. Otherwise, appropriate responses to life's demands would be impossible. I call this the midpoint mechanics. When a goal forms within us, its implementation and achievement always require two structures, one within ourselves and one in the external world. This means that they must each form a real network within ourselves and a virtual network in the world, enabling the path to the goal. Why and how the psyche arose can be clearly described. The inanimate world is indifferent to what happens. The animate world cannot be indifferent. At the beginning of all life on our planet, approximately 3.5 billion years ago, favorable environmental conditions allowed the first primitive forms to form from inanimate matter through chemical reactions. The subsequent course of Earth's development brought forth countless living beings. From the goals that arose for survival, a simple psyche gradually constructed itself. This has expanded through adaptations over the course of evolution and developed and improved through ever new demands on increasingly diverse life forms. This gave rise to the worldview of living beings. It developed over a long period through the increase of emotions. Cognitive perceptions, i.e., how laws operate within substances and their environment, only emerged much, much later. At the beginning of life, the goal was to live, to survive. From this perspective, the world that the respective beings then perceived took shape. Goals can lead one into correspondingly positive structures, but also into negative ones. For example, when one finds oneself in a comfortable world and can no longer escape it, such as in an addiction. Because this is not to be relinquished, the same mechanism takes effect and blocks out everything that could be disruptive. The reason, the goal, in this case, the structure in which one feels comfortable, demands to be fulfilled. Healthy behaviors are gradually neglected. The midpoint mechanic, which is also at work here, has tremendous power to prevent the perception of facts. This can be a devilish trap. Even though no supernatural forces are at work, only mechanical facts. As a rule, the midpoint mechanic are particularly difficult to recognize because it is believed that decisions are made solely with one's ego. As a result, goals that lie beneath the surface of perception, but are nevertheless effective, are often not seen or cannot be perceived. one is blind to them. If these blind people were to recognize the midpoint mechanic in the brain, i.e., how they operate, they would be one step closer to illuminating their darkness. However, the second step, to become aware that a life mechanism is responsible for this, would still be a very long way off, because they would have to overcome their feeling that something else is telling them. Namely, that they themselves possess the freedom of choice, and not some mechanism within them. Thus, the midpoint mechanic have two sides: positive goals through the exclusion of anything that does not support them. Negative goals are pursued by suppressing anything that contradicts them. The second point can be fatal, especially for people in power, often including the intelligent ones. This mechanism can completely block out empathy. For example, why don't many people see this process, even when it's practically shoved in their faces? Because they were also blinded by a perceived belief in higher spiritual, metaphysical beings, to whom they may feel a kinship, perhaps even as chosen ones. They needed these beings to understand what they couldn't explain. This view was then reinforced by the midpoint mechanic. To recognize these processes, one would have to be able to examine one's feelings more closely and, when negative goals are registered, leave one's comfort zone. This can be difficult. Furthermore, the older one gets, the more entrenched these goals become. This generally leads to a restriction of mental and cognitive flexibility. People often fall into certain personal patterns when they want to achieve something. Unfortunately, this also applies to negative behavior. This blinds them to what doesn't fit their particular goal. As mentioned, mental agility decreases with age. Furthermore, people generally follow their well-trodden paths. The midpoint mechanic are not a quirk of nature, but an essential element that enables living beings to carry out and achieve goals. Understanding the midpoint mechanic allows one to recognize the patterns of their own psyche.